Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the problem was final, the house was empty, and his bow was last, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Why would the Pope engage Sherlock Holmes' services? Why did he receive the Legion of Honor from France? And why would he refuse a knighthood?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 337, Business at the Cedars. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the podcast where we talk about the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
And I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, do you have all of your cedar balls and cedar planks and everything ready to go, keeping the moths away?
Not only that, I am recording this from the interior of my cedar-lined hope chest. In fact, it's my Jefferson hope chest.
There's great hope for that guy.
Yes.
Well, this should be a rather interesting episode because we are looking at something that is truly a trifle. It is a bit of minutia that I don't think I really paid much attention to myself, and in our pre-show discussion, it was so minute, I think it even escaped you when I pointed it out.
Yeah. Well, I have that rare gift of when you tell me exactly a page number and to look at a line of type, that I wind up quoting poetry from Robbie Burns. So it wasn't I wasn't surprised by my inability to find it, but clearly you were.
As long as I have a good bit of scotch in my hand, I don't object to your use of Burns at all.
Hoot, hoot.
Well, this really comes down to this entire episode centers on a question that Watson put to Sherlock Holmes in the case of the man with a twisted lip. He asked Holmes, "Why are you not conducting the case from Baker Street?" And that is the trifle upon which we shall canoodle in this particular episode. Before we do, just a reminder that you can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/trifles337, all lowercase. That'll take you directly to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website. You can rifle through the various links there, as well as find our Patreon button, where you can support the show for as little as $1 a month, becoming a part of the great mechanism that causes Trifles to be produced every single week without fail, now in its 7th season. We thank our Patreon supporters, and we do encourage as many people who want to sign up to check us out there. And you can even pick a level that makes sense for you, that gives you a little thank you gift from us. Just a little trifle, shall we say. Well, Bert, I mentioned Watson's grand question, but if we want to really understand the context of this question, why don't you set up for us what the scenario was, what the circumstances were under which Watson asked that question?
Oh, it's a very unusual set of circumstances, too, that's somewhat unique, and we see that, fairly rarely. Of course, that's what the word unique means. In the cases of Sherlock Holmes, this is a case that begins with Dr. Watson with Sherlock Holmes nowhere on the scene. And, basically he's at home with his wife, and the Watson household is approached by a very anxious woman, and gives us an opportunity for Watson to talk fondly about the fact that his wife attracts all sorts of people who are in trouble. They flock to her. But it turns out this particular friend of his wife has a husband who has unfortunately succumbed to the evil influence of opium and has been absent for quite a long while. And Watson, being the brave fellow that he is, immediately leaps to the opportunity to go to this vile den and rescue him, and being there, encounters, amazingly, Sherlock Holmes. So we dispense pretty quickly with poor Isa Whitney and get focused on the case that Holmes is investigating, and he's investigating a case that also involves a disappearance of a husband. But in this case, it's not very clear. In this case, some very interesting things are going on, but why don't I just sort of stop there and let you pick up the tale?
I will do that. And on my way there, I should note that you did mention the beginning of the case and Watson and Mrs. Watson receiving a visitor. It was during this brief interlude that Watson tells us that his wife referred to him as James rather than John. And longtime listeners of Trifles will know that we did cover that trifle in the very first season of the show. And if you've joined us and haven't gone back and listened to all of them yet, we'll have a link to episode 7, John, James, and Mary, where you can have that related trifle at your disposal. So anyway, Watson encounters Holmes in an opium den, in disguise, of course. Holmes is there trying to get some reconnaissance, some information, some observations on this disappeared fellow by the name of Neville St. Clair, as you say, because his disappearance coincided with the appearance of one Hugh Boone at the Bar of Gold opium den. Watson was there searching for Isa Whitney. Holmes recognizes Watson. They were each surprised to find each other in such an establishment, and they meet outside and hop into a trap and head 7 miles out of town to the Cedars in Lee in the county of Kent, well outside the main metropolis of London. And along the way, Holmes gives Watson a background on exactly what happened with respect to Neville St. Clair and his disappearance and the arrest of Hugh Boone under suspicion of making away with Neville St. Clair. We know that St. Clair was on the premises. His overcoat and I think a couple of other articles of his clothing were found. But
the
Hugh
box
Boone
of bricks that he was
that's right.
that he was fetching for his child.
Yeah. So seemingly all of the clues, all of the evidence, all of the things related to the mysterious events were there on site. And Holmes was staking out the premises, as I said. However, Watson, on this drive, Holmes told Watson that he had a couple of rooms at his disposal at the Cedars, thanks to Mrs. St. Clair. And as we said at the top of the show, Watson said, "But why are you not conducting the case from Baker Street?" Holmes mentioned that he would be at the Cedars for a few days, if I'm not mistaken. Said, "My room at the Cedars is a double-bedded one." Watson says, "The Cedars? Yes, that's Mrs. St. Clair's house. I'm staying there while I conduct the inquiry." Staying at the Cedars while conducting the inquiry. And I guess the question for us is, why on earth would Sherlock Holmes need to be making his base of operations 7 miles outside of the city, outside of the center of action where it happened?
Yes, well, this is a question that's occupied many people over the years. D. Martin Dakin, whom we've talked about in the past, characterizes Holmes's answer as evasive. There have been essays written by people like Roberta Pearson, who imagined that Holmes might have been having an illicit liaison with Mrs. St. Clair. And then Bernard Davies has written that Neville St. Clair and Holmes were old friends, perhaps. And, St. Clair's expertise in makeup, all of this could have related perhaps to them being old friends in the theater, perhaps. Well, D. Martin Dakin objected to the fact that they were friends. Brad Kefauver has written about Mrs. St. Clair's great qualities, her admirable qualities, presumed that she had a flair for the dramatic, and pointed out that Holmes seemed uncharacteristically, at least to Brad, friendly to his client. And, there could have been a connection there. And there have been other speculations about a romantic liaison between Holmes and Mrs. St. Clair. But all of that is obviously admirable in its effort, but clearly poppycock.
Well, why don't we leave it there for a moment, leave our listeners to ponder that as we head into the break, and we'll pick it up on the other side. Stay with us. The Baker Street Journal has undergone minor changes from time to time, but the good news is it still looks and feels the same as it has over the last decade, even though it has a new editor. Dan Andriacco brings the sensibilities of a journalist, editor, and lifelong Sherlockian to the BSJ as he takes over for Steve Rothman, who spent 23 years in the editor's seat. In his outgoing editorial, Steve reminds us about the attraction and staying power of the Baker Street Journal. When I started reading submissions for the Journal in the autumn of 1999, I was impressed by their quantity and quality. 23 years on, that judgment hasn't changed. I am regularly amazed by Journal's writers' ingenuity. They are curious, imaginative, and widely read. And he's absolutely right. Get yourself on a list of subscribers so you too can be impressed with what Baker Street Journal writers have to say on a quarterly basis. Simply go to bakerstreetirregulars.com and sign up today. Okay, we're talking about Mrs. Sinclair as a long-term friend, maybe even a romantic liaison to Sherlock Holmes. I think it's been pretty well established that Holmes really did not have a romantic bone in his body. He did appreciate women and their usefulness in cases, certainly. He had great respect for Irena Adler and very few other women. But to consider Mrs. Sinclair as a romantic partner for Holmes, it seems a little bit off the reservation, so to speak. So, what do you make of it, Bert?
Well, I think there are two real potential reasons for this. One is the superficial face value statement about what's going on. Again, just to point out here, and this is really critical, and I'll come back to this for the second potential answer here. The first potential answer, you have to point out Watson came in late here. So he's missed some details, but we do find out during the course of the case that Holmes has already done the investigation. He's looked into the 37-year-old Neville St. Clair, who had no particular job but seemed reasonably well off, who would frequently go into the city, very regularly go into the city. He has 88 pounds of debt. He's got no significant financial worries. So Holmes has looked at the bank deposits and so on and can't really find anything more about that. He's certainly done his diligence there. So, but also you have this second point here where Holmes says, as he and Watson are making their arrival at the Cedars, he says, "See that light among the trees? That is the Cedars." And beside that lamp sits a woman whose anxious ears have already, I have little doubt, caught the clink of our horses' feet. So he realizes that his client is concerned about her husband and quite concerned. And in fact, in the next scene, when they get to the Cedars, she will put it to him very plainly, do you think my husband is dead? And basically Holmes says, yeah, unfortunately, madam, I do. And of course, there's a great stroke there in her next sentence. But the point is, at this point, Sherlock Holmes feels that Neville St. Clair is dead, murdered, and as there are no more avenues to pursue in terms of his professional and financial connections in London, he is in a position to help and to offer some sort of comfort, however small, to Neville St. Clair's wife as she becomes, unfortunately, a widow, he thinks. And that's certainly one answer. That's the as stated answer. And I'll hold my second answer until you comment upon that.
Well, I think that's a very reasonable supposition. I mean, it takes into account all of the facts that we have at our disposal. It doesn't invent any of these kind of prearranged or predestined relationships, like Bernard Davies saying that Holmes and Neville St. Clair were on the stage together, which is odd because Holmes would have recognized the equipment and the techniques that a fellow theatrical type would have used. So, yeah, I'm interested though to hear about what your second supposition is.
Well, my second supposition is to take a look at this question from the standpoint of a writer. And the fact is that Watson came in late. Now, the reason Watson came in late is that this particular case is in the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And so we've already been through A Scandal in Bohemia, The Red-Headed League, A Case of Identity, The Boscombe Valley Mystery, The Five Orange Pips. We've been through those cases. And now we're in The Strand. Now we're at The Man with the Twisted Lip. And so, from the standpoint of a fiction writer or an author, the author, let's say it's Watson. Watson has written these cases, and they all kind of begin in the same way. They begin in Baker Street. There's a knock on the door, a client arrives. But this is a different sort of case because there's a lot of emotional anxiety that involves an ordinary woman's worry about her inexplicably missing husband. And so the case begins uncharacteristically in the Watson household. And we have this immediate emotional scene, this incident, these events around Mary Watson comforting, as she would many others, a troubled friend. And then we got immediately to this scene of menace and evil. What could befall a man? And so the case is presented with this emotional, comforting scene, information, the menace of the opium den, the evil opium den that a good man could fall into. And now the worry that that the reader has about Neville St. Clair, really has some support. But now you've got an issue. What do you do next? And what you do next is you need to get your people to Mrs. St. Clair, but she's not going to be coming back to Baker Street. So what happens is, you have to enlist Watson. You started with Watson at home. You've got to extract him from his house for some reason. And he's got to do more than just go to Baker Street. After all, we're concerned about Mrs. St. Clair. So now we need to get our people there, and we get our people there. And then it's good that we did because we've got a stroke coming about whether or not Neville St. Clair is really dead. So from the standpoint of constructing a narrative, you really couldn't do anything else, or at least nothing else that would be so effective.
Well, that's an interesting point. I definitely see how, from a writer's perspective, it works wonders. And in this narrative scenario that we're presented with, where Holmes and Watson, where the dog cart kind of doubles for a Baker Street sitting room, where Holmes is able to kind of give Watson the facts of the case in lieu of a client showing up and giving them the facts of the case. This works well, and it transports them out to the Cedars at the time. I would like to point one thing out. It's a trifle within a trifle, so to speak. So they're on their way out to the Cedars. Holmes is spending time out there after had spent time out there, had done his research out in that area. But we're not told, by Holmes himself, we're not told how Mrs. Sinclair actually came to engage his services in the first place, from what I can tell.
Oh, that's true. I think that is missing information.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I think, and it's probably useful. It's good that it's missing. I think that's a clue, actually, to the second answer that I was proposing here, because think about it. If you were now in the sixth adventure and it began like all the others in Baker Street, and a troubled woman shows up, presuming there's some sort of connection. I've heard of you. I've read of you. Someone recommended me to you. My husband is, Holmes, it would be difficult. You can see the difficulty that he has really with Violet Hunter until he gets into her case in the Copper Beeches. Looking after lost husbands. My husband has disappeared. She's been to the police. There's a lot of information about what actually happened at the Bar of Gold, and it would just be certainly nowhere near as effective and engaging and interesting as what we've seen already.
Well, that's a good point. And dropping us into the action in the middle of it, we can probably already imagine that if Holmes had been out there at the Cedars for a few days, that he had already looked at the bell pulls and the ventilators and ruled out a snake.
Yeah.
In this case.
Yeah, but more to the point, look what you get with this. And now, admittedly, the fact that he's there for several days, that is curious. And it's worth talking about and exploring. But the value you get is you get this magic trick of his appearance in the opium den, when the last thing you're expecting to see is Sherlock Holmes. There's Watson in the opium den, and he's doing, and son of a gun, there's, not only is it Sherlock Holmes, but he's in disguise. Oh, boy.
Well, it really makes for, as you say, a dramatic opening. And I think it's been used to great effect in some of the productions, certainly in The Crucifer of Blood, when that was brought to stage and later to film. This is the iconic Sherlock Holmes, a Sherlock Holmes of many disguises, unrecognizable even to Watson. It's just another notch in this character development of Sherlock Holmes that makes us appreciate his skill and his willingness to go where others typically wouldn't.
Yeah. But in a way, too, I agree with you. You're very right. But I agree with you. It's a bookend, isn't it? Because at the beginning of the case, Sherlock Holmes emerges from the guise of this disguised inhabitant of the opium den. And we know when we get to the end of the case that Neville St. Clair is going to emerge from the shabby appearance of Hugh Boone. And I can imagine certainly the literary agent, when he read this, putting down his pen and saying, yeah, I rather like that.
Yeah, it's a lovely application or de-application of disguises on either end. And again, the wonderful use of tobacco as an enlightening agent for Holmes as he consumed an ounce of shag on 5 pillows.
Yes.
And there at the very end, he says to Watson, I reached the results by sitting upon 5 pillows and consuming an ounce of shag. I think, Watson, that if we drive to Baker Street, we shall just be in time for breakfast. and there, once again, we are transplanted to the headquarters, the proper headquarters of Sherlock Holmes, and we're back in our rightful place.
Yes, and he will be bringing with him on his return to Baker Street his dressing gown, which we also did not satisfactorily explain how that traveled to the Cedars, but that's another trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Where exactly are we going?
The Cedars, a lovely villa near Lee in Kent.
May I ask why I'm going to Lee in Kent? In the middle of the night on a Friday in March?
Because you are my trusty comrade and my loyal chronicler, I may be